Something quietly broke when a major U.S. trade program expired, and almost no one noticed at first. Because if South Africa were truly dependent on U.S. market access, panic would have followed immediately. Factories would have sounded alarms. Markets would have reacted. Instead, American lawmakers were the ones scrambling, rushing a bill through the House to revive AGOA, as if something vital was slipping away.
Following months of tension between Washington and Pretoria, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, looks set to be reinstated after a US House committee approved a bill renewing the preferential trade program for another 3 years, while there was no immediate mention of excluding South Africa.
So what exactly went wrong? Why did the United States move faster than South Africa to save a trade law that was supposed to give Washington leverage? And why does this extension feel less like generosity and more like desperation? Let's find out. To understand why Washington panicked, you first have to understand what AGOA actually was beneath the slogans. Not a trade deal, not a development program, an economic design.
What are we going to do about South Africa as part of AGOA?
Well,
I mean, South Africa is clearly not America's friend.
That's correct. We've had some conversations with the South Africans when it comes to trade. And again, there are a lot of kind of foreign policy issues that I don't get into with South Africa. But when it comes to trade, they have a lot of barriers, not just tariff, but non-tariff barriers, et cetera. We've made clear to the South Africans that if they ever want to have a better tariff situation with us, they need to take care of these tariffs and non-tariff barriers. They're a real economy. They're a big economy, right? They have an industrial base. They have an agricultural base. They should be buying things from the United States.
But if you extend AGOA for 1 year without reforming it, that's going to benefit South Africa, right?
When AGOA was created in 2000, the United States was facing a problem it didn't want to admit publicly. Its industrial base was already hollowing out. Factories had been offshored, labor costs had risen, and domestic manufacturing could no longer compete the way it once did. Instead of rebuilding that capacity at home, Washington chose a quieter solution: externalize production while keeping control. AGOA became the mechanism. African countries were offered duty-free access, but only if they exported into U.S. systems under U.S. rules tied to U.S. buyers. On paper, it looked like an opportunity. In practice, it created dependency corridors, pipelines that fed American supply chains while keeping African economies structurally outward-facing. South Africa was the centerpiece of that design. Unlike many exporters, South Africa didn't just ship raw materials. It supplied finished vehicles, auto components, processed agricultural goods, chemicals, and industrial inputs. These weren't symbolic exports. They were deeply embedded in American production cycles. Entire U.S. industries quietly relied on South African capacity to stay profitable. AGOA allowed the U.S. to enjoy the benefits of industrial production without paying the political or financial cost of rebuilding its own manufacturing sector. South Africa became a plug-in factory, close enough to be reliable, distant enough to be cheap, and politically framed as beneficiary rather than partner. That framing mattered. As long as AGOA existed, Washington could pretend it was doing Africa a favor, while Africa was expected to behave politically, diplomatically, and strategically. Market access was the reward. Disobedience risked exclusion. For 2 decades, that leverage held. But leverage only works if the system has a single center. And while Washington was busy managing optics, the world quietly stopped being unipolar. Manufacturing shifted. Capital diversified. Trade routes multiplied. The same globalization that once empowered U.S. dominance began dissolving it. South Africa noticed early. AGOA, once a gate, slowly became just one road among many. Useful, but no longer defining. And that subtle shift changed everything, because when a country no longer sees access as survival, pressure stops working. Washington didn't realize the lock had loosened until it heard nothing. No protests, no emergency appeals, no fear. That silence wasn't confusion. It was confidence.
Trade is now being used as a weapon against a number of countries in the world. multilateral trading system needs to be reformed as we reconfirm that the World Trade Organization remains the only multilateral body that is capable of managing differences and coordinating positions in global trade. Trade is one of the most important instruments to mobilize domestic resources for development.
So if AGOA was designed to keep South Africa economically orbiting the United States, why didn't its expiration cause panic? And what did South Africa see coming that Washington missed? The reason South Africa did not panic when AGOA expired is simple, but uncomfortable for Washington. The United States was no longer the center of its economic universe. This shift did not happen overnight, and it did not come with speeches or declarations. It happened through contracts, ports, shipping lanes, and balance sheets. While Washington was still speaking the language of access and eligibility, South Africa was building optionality. Trade patterns tell the story better than diplomacy ever could. Over the last decade, South Africa steadily expanded its export destinations beyond the traditional Western axis. Asia absorbed more manufactured goods. The Middle East became a major buyer of processed agricultural products. Regional African trade deepened, reducing reliance on distant markets altogether. None of this was framed as defiance, it was framed as efficiency. That distinction matters, because countries that diversify quietly do not need to announce independence, they demonstrate it. At the same time, global manufacturing itself was changing. Supply chains were no longer linear pipelines pointing toward the US. They became networks. Redundancy replaced loyalty. Speed replaced tradition. South Africa adapted to that reality faster than Washington expected. AGOA still mattered, but it stopped being existential. So when the program expired, South Africa didn't scramble to renegotiate. It didn't flood Washington with pleas. It treated the lapse as friction, not a catastrophe. Exporters adjusted pricing. Firms redirected shipments. Contracts were rewritten, not canceled. The system bent, but it did not break. That calm response revealed something the US had failed to measure. South Africa had already priced in the risk of Western unpredictability. Years of diplomatic tension, shifting US policy priorities, and political pressure campaigns had taught Pretoria a lesson. Access that depends on compliance is unstable. Unstable access is not a foundation. It is a liability. So South Africa reduced exposure. This is where Washington miscalculated. US policymakers assumed that market access still functioned as leverage. But leverage only works when alternatives are worse. In South Africa's case, alternatives were no longer inferior, they were simply different, and in some cases faster, cheaper, and politically cleaner. The expiration of AGOA was supposed to be a reminder of American power. Instead, it became a stress test, and South Africa passed. That is why the silence was so unsettling. Because silence means adaptation has already happened. And once a system adapts, restoring the old hierarchy becomes almost impossible. You can revive a law. You cannot revive dependence. This was the moment Washington realized it had been negotiating with an economy that had already moved on. Which raises the next question. If South Africa wasn't the one in trouble, who actually felt the shock when AGOA disappeared? And where did the real panic begin? When AGOA expired, the first signs of trouble did not appear in South African factories or government offices. They appeared in internal memos, industry calls, and congressional inboxes across the United States. This is the part rarely discussed publicly because it flips the entire narrative. American companies were the ones exposed. For years, US industries had quietly structured their supply chains around South African production. Automotive firms relied on South African components that met US standards without US labor costs. Retailers depended on agricultural imports that were stable, predictable, and competitively priced. Industrial buyers counted on processed materials that slotted seamlessly into American manufacturing cycles. AGOA made all of this frictionless. Once it lapsed, that friction returned instantly. Tariffs didn't just threaten profit margins, they threatened planning. Costs became unpredictable, contracts became unstable, and replacing South Africa was not as simple as switching suppliers. Few countries offered the same combination of scale, quality, reliability, and political insulation. This is where the panic actually began. Industry groups started warning lawmakers that delays would translate directly into higher consumer prices. Auto manufacturers flagged disruptions months in advance. Importers warned that reshoring was unrealistic in the short term and alternative sourcing would be more expensive. The message to Congress was blunt. This was not Africa's problem. It was America's vulnerability. That message worked. The U.S. House did not move out of generosity or long-term vision. It moved because domestic pressure reached a breaking point. The AGOA extension became a defensive maneuver, an attempt to freeze supply chains in place while Washington figured out what to do next. This explains the speed. Bills tied to foreign policy usually crawl. This one sprinted. What made the situation worse was the timing. The expiration came as the U.S. was already dealing with inflation sensitivity, political polarization, and manufacturing instability. Any shock to consumer prices was politically dangerous. AGOA had quietly become part of America's internal economic stability, without anyone admitting it out loud. That is the irony. A program framed as helping Africa ended up shielding the U.S. from the consequences of its own industrial decline. And when that shield disappeared, the reaction was immediate.
But I think South Africa is a unique case. I agree with you, if that's your point.
And don't you think we ought to separate South Africa and AGOA?
I mean, I'm happy to consider that, right? I mean, Congress has come to me and said, we want AGOA. And I think if we're going to have a giveaway, we need to figure out how to improve it. You know, if you think that we should give South Africa different treatment, I'm open to that because I think they are a unique problem.
South Africa watched all of this without drama. It did not rush statements. It did not threaten retaliation. It let the market speak. And the market spoke loudly in Washington. By the time the House voted, the narrative had already shifted behind closed doors. AGOA was no longer leverage. It was insurance. But insurance only delays the underlying problem. Because if the U.S. needed to move this fast once, it would need to move even faster the next time. Which leads to the uncomfortable question Washington tried to avoid. If political pressure failed and economic pressure backfired, what leverage does the U.S. actually have left? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Once the economic panic set in, Washington faced a deeper problem it could not solve with legislation alone. Its political pressure had stopped working. Before AGOA expired, the United States assumed it still had a familiar toolkit: public criticism, diplomatic warnings, subtle threats tied to market access. The logic was old but simple. Signal displeasure, apply pressure, expect compliance. That approach had worked in earlier decades when access to Western markets was scarce and alternatives were limited. This time, it failed. South Africa did not reverse its positions. It did not soften its foreign policy. It did not recalibrate its global relationships to please Washington. Instead, it absorbed the pressure and continued moving forward, treating U.S. criticism as background noise rather than instruction. That reaction exposed something uncomfortable. The U.S. had overestimated its own authority. Political pressure only works when the target fears exclusion. But South Africa had already neutralized that fear by reducing reliance on any single market. When Washington hinted at consequences, Pretoria didn't argue, it calculated. And the calculations no longer pointed in one direction. This is where the mask slipped. Because once pressure failed, Washington had only two options left: escalate or retreat. Escalation risked accelerating South Africa's full pivot away from U.S.-centric trade. Retreat risked exposing weakness. The AGOA extension was chosen as a compromise, neither victory nor surrender, but a pause. And pauses are telling. They signal uncertainty. The U.S. could no longer dictate terms, but it also couldn't afford to walk away. That limbo revealed a reversal of roles that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. The country that once set the rules was now trying to keep a seat at the table. South Africa understood this immediately. That is why its response remained measured. No triumphalism, no public taunts, just steady engagement on its own terms. Confidence does not need volume. Meanwhile, Washington's tone softened. Threats gave way to reassurance. Lectures were replaced with language about mutual benefit and predictability. These weren't rhetorical upgrades, they were concessions. Because once a power begins explaining itself, it has already lost the upper hand. The AGOA extension did not restore control. It acknowledged its absence, and more importantly, it signaled to South Africa and the rest of the continent that US pressure had limits. Once those limits are visible, they cannot be unseen. That realization travels fast. If Washington could not bend South Africa through politics or economics, then the old playbook was finished. What remained was negotiation, but negotiation only works when both sides need the outcome. Which brings us to the next turning point. What does South Africa do when it realizes it no longer needs to choose, only to evaluate? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. This is the moment where the entire balance shifted, and it didn't happen in Washington. It happened quietly in Pretoria, boardrooms, export councils, logistics firms, and long-term planning documents that never make headlines. South Africa stopped asking, how do we stay inside the US system? And started asking a very different question. What is the US system worth to us now? That difference is everything. For decades, trade decisions were shaped by fear of exclusion. Losing access to Western markets meant isolation, capital flight, and economic pain. That fear disciplined policy. It shaped diplomacy. It narrowed choices. AGOA thrived in that environment because it didn't need to threaten loudly. The consequences were assumed. But once South Africa built parallel trade routes, that fear evaporated. Not because the US market became irrelevant, but because it stopped being irreplaceable. That's when evaluation replaced obedience. South African exporters began treating the US like any other buyer. Price-sensitive, politically unpredictable, valuable, but not central. Contracts were assessed against Asian demand. Long-term planning factored in Middle Eastern logistics hubs. Regional African trade was no longer symbolic, it became strategic. In that environment, AGOA stopped being a lever and became a variable. And variables don't command loyalty, they compete. This is why South Africa didn't celebrate the AGOA extension. Celebration implies relief. There was none. What followed instead was calm acceptance, because the law no longer determined survival. It merely improved margins. That distinction matters more than any speech. When a country negotiates for survival, it compromises values. When it negotiates from strength, it sets conditions. South Africa is now firmly in the second category. It can accept US access without political alignment. It can engage without submission. It can walk away without collapsing. That reality reshapes every future conversation. Washington is no longer dealing with a dependent partner. It is dealing with an economy that can delay, redirect, and disengage without panic. And that makes every demand riskier for the one making it. Because when leverage disappears, pressure becomes self-harm. This is the quiet power shift the AGOA episode revealed. Not a dramatic break, not a headline moment, just a recalibration. Slow, deliberate, irreversible. South Africa didn't announce independence from US trade influence. It simply stopped treating that influence as decisive. And once a country reaches that point, extensions and incentives only buy time, not loyalty. So with AGOA extended for just 3 years and South Africa no longer dependent on the delay, the final question becomes unavoidable. When the clock runs out again, will the United States have anything left to offer that South Africa actually needs? By the time AGOA was revived, the outcome was already decided, just not in the way Washington hoped. This extension did not reset the relationship, it exposed its limits. 3 years is not a commitment. It is a pause button. A temporary delay is imposed by a power that understands it no longer controls the direction of travel. The United States didn't extend AGOA because it suddenly rediscovered belief in African partnership. It did so because it needed time. Time to protect vulnerable industries, time to prevent supply chain shock, and time to slow South Africa's momentum away from US-centered trade. But time only helps if the underlying trend is reversible. and this one isn't. South Africa has already crossed the most important threshold in global economics. It knows it can absorb pressure without collapsing. Once a country internalizes that truth, leverage stops being leverage. Threats turn into noise, incentives turn into negotiations, and dominance turns into persuasion. That is why this moment matters far beyond AGOA, because it signals to the rest of Africa that dependency is not permanent, and that diversification is not defiance, but insurance. South Africa didn't need to confront Washington directly. It didn't need to announce a break. It simply demonstrated resilience, and resilience is contagious. The United States now faces a problem it cannot solve with extensions or deadlines. Influence that relies on exclusivity fails in a world where exclusivity no longer exists. The US market is valuable, but it is no longer singular. Its rules matter, but they are no longer final. Its approval helps, but it is no longer required. AGOA's revival delays recognition of that reality, but it doesn't change it. When this extension expires, Washington will face the same question again, only with less leverage and fewer illusions. And South Africa will face it with more options, deeper integration elsewhere, and even greater confidence. This is why the silence from Pretoria mattered more than the vote in Congress. Silence means preparation is complete. The real story, then, is not whether AGOA survives another cycle. It is whether the United States can adapt to a world where it must compete for relevance rather than assume it. Because competition demands respect, consistency, and mutual benefit, not pressure dressed as partnership. South Africa has already adjusted to that world. The United States is still catching up. And when the next deadline arrives, the question won't be whether South Africa is allowed to trade freely. It will be whether the US is still part of the equation, or merely one option among many. Let us know in the comments section. Will South Africa choose the US? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.